40 luxury vacation cabins were fully built, fully furnished, and less than a week away from welcoming their first guests when a single legal notice brought the entire project to a dead stop. The developer had spent millions of dollars. Contractors had worked for nearly a year. Online bookings were already coming in, and people were posting excited comments about their upcoming lakefront getaway. Then suddenly, everything froze. No grand opening. No kayaking tours. No swimming packages. No lakeside adventures. Just 40 empty cabins sitting quietly across the water while a very angry developer tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The funny part is that nobody had stolen anything. Nobody had sabotaged the construction site, and nobody had filed some ridiculous lawsuit looking for easy money. The truth was much simpler than that. They built an entire business around a lake without ever asking who actually controlled the water that made the lake possible in the first place. My name is Ethan Mercer, and the lake at the center of this story has been part of my family for longer than I've been alive. It sits in a shallow valley about 20 miles outside a small town called Briar Creek, surrounded by pine forests and rolling hills that seem to swallow noise before it can travel very far. If you've never lived near a place like that, it's hard to explain what the silence feels like. Not empty silence. Comfortable silence. The kind where you hear birds before you hear cars, where mornings begin with fog floating across the water and evenings end with nothing but crickets and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Growing up, that lake felt like its own little world. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, bought the property back in the late 1950s when nobody wanted it. According to family stories, everyone thought he was crazy. The land was remote, heavily wooded, and difficult to access. But Grandpa saw something nobody else noticed. Hidden near the northern ridge was a natural spring that poured cold, crystal-clear water out of the hillside year-round. Over time, that spring fed a small basin and created the lake that would eventually become the heart of the property. Grandpa loved that spring. He trusted it. He used to tell me that water was more valuable than land, because land without water was just dirt waiting to disappoint somebody. As a kid, I thought that sounded like one of those old man sayings people repeat because they enjoy hearing themselves talk. Years later, I realized he was smarter than all of us. When Grandpa officially registered the property, he did something most people would have overlooked. He had the spring legally documented as a private water source connected directly to the land title. At the time, it seemed completely unnecessary. There were no resorts nearby, no commercial developments, no investors looking for vacation destinations. It was just paperwork buried inside county records that nobody ever looked at. For decades, life remained simple. My father inherited the property after Grandpa passed away, and eventually it came to me. The lake stayed exactly the way it had always been. Quiet, peaceful, predictable. Every morning, I walked the shoreline with my old black lab, Cooper. Every fall, I watched orange and red leaves reflect across the water like a painting somebody forgot to finish. Every winter, I sat beside the fireplace during storms and listened to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't an exciting life, but honestly, that was the entire reason I loved it. Then one summer things started changing. The first sign was a row of bright orange survey stakes appearing across the lake on a piece of land that had once been an abandoned cattle pasture. I noticed them while fishing one afternoon. A week later, bulldozers showed up, then excavators, then dump trucks. Every morning, I woke up to another section of forest being cleared. At first, I didn't think much about it. Property changes hands. People build houses. That's life. But as the months passed, the scale of the project became impossible to ignore. New gravel roads cut through the hillsides. Utility crews arrived. Construction trailers appeared. Then one afternoon, a giant sign went up near the entrance road. Hollow Ridge Nature Retreat coming soon. I actually laughed when I saw it. Not because it was funny, but because half the nature they were advertising had already been bulldozed to make room for the project. A few days later, my neighbor Frank Dawson stopped by. Frank had lived in the area almost as long as my family. He looked across the lake, watched the construction equipment moving around, and shook his head. "You know what's coming, right?" he asked. "Tourists," I said. He laughed. "Lots of tourists." Neither of us realized just how right he was. Over the following months, the development exploded. One cabin became 5. 5 became 15. Then 25. Eventually, 40 separate vacation cabins stretched across the opposite shoreline, each one carefully positioned to maximize the lake view. Every cabin had a wooden deck. Every cabin had a fire pit. Every cabin had a direct path leading toward the water. The advertisements started appearing online before construction was even finished. Escape to nature. Relax by the lake. Enjoy kayaking and swimming. Experience peaceful mornings on pristine waters. The more I looked at the marketing, the more uncomfortable I became. Because the lake wasn't just part of the project. The lake was the project. Every advertisement featured the water. Every photo highlighted the shoreline. Every promise depended on the lake being available to guests. And yet nobody from the development company had ever contacted me. Not once. No introductions. No meetings. No discussions about access. No conversations about environmental impact. Nothing. At first I convinced myself it probably wasn't an issue. Maybe they had their own permits. Maybe they were relying on independent water systems. Maybe everything had been handled legally behind the scenes. Then one afternoon, while walking near the northern edge of my property, I noticed several workers installing pipes near the narrow stream that carried water from my family's spring into the lake. I stopped walking and watched them for several minutes. The longer I stood there, the worse the feeling in my stomach became. Because for the first time in years, I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me whenever we visited the spring. Most people pay attention to the lake, he'd say. Smart people pay attention to where the water comes from. Standing there beside that stream, watching strangers dig into ground they clearly assumed nobody cared about, I suddenly had a feeling Grandpa's forgotten paperwork was about to become very important. That evening I couldn't stop thinking about those pipes. I tried. I really did. I sat on my porch, grilled a couple burgers, watched the sun disappear behind the trees, but every time my mind settled down, it drifted right back to the same question. Why were they working near the stream? The next morning I drove into Briar Creek and spent most of the day digging through county records. Now, I know that sounds incredibly boring, because it was. There is nothing glamorous about sitting in a government building flipping through permit documents while fluorescent lights hum overhead. But after several hours, I found exactly what I was looking for. The developer, a company called Horizon Outdoor Ventures, had permits for roads, cabins, septic systems, electrical work, and guest facilities. Everything looked perfectly organized. Everything looked professional. Then I reached the section describing the lake. That's when things got interesting. The paperwork referred to the lake as a natural recreational resource available to support tourism activities associated with the development. That wording might not sound important, but it immediately caught my attention. Because the lake wasn't simply a natural recreational resource. The lake existed because of a privately owned spring. There is a huge legal difference between those two things. I requested additional documents and spent another 2 days reviewing old property records. The deeper I looked, the more obvious the problem became. Somewhere during the planning process, somebody had assumed the lake was public in the practical sense. Maybe they saw water and stopped asking questions. Maybe they assumed nobody would care. Maybe they never bothered researching the source. Whatever happened, they had built an entire business model around a resource they didn't actually control. A week later, I hired a water rights attorney named Laura Bennett. Laura was one of those people who could make a 10-minute explanation sound like a courtroom closing argument. After reviewing everything, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. Well, she said, this is either very good news for you or very bad news for them. How bad? I asked. She slid the documents across the desk. If these records are accurate, they can't legally use that water for commercial purposes without your permission. I stared at her. You're serious? Completely serious. Even after spending all that money? Laura shrugged. The amount of money they spent doesn't change who owns the rights. For the first time since the construction started, I realized I actually had leverage. Not because I wanted leverage. Not because I wanted a fight. But because nobody had ever bothered including me in a project that depended heavily on something my family legally controlled. Around that same time, the resort entered its final construction phase. The place looked impressive, I'll admit it. New landscaping appeared around the cabins. Decorative signs were installed along the trails. Large kayak racks showed up near the shoreline. Workers built a long wooden dock extending into the lake. They even installed outdoor string lights that reflected across the water at night. If you didn't know the backstory, it looked like a postcard. One afternoon, I drove past the entrance and noticed a banner hanging across the gate. Grand opening this summer. Reservations now available. I remember sitting in my truck staring at that sign. There must have been 20 different contractors working on site. Guests were already posting excitement online. Families were planning vacations. Couples were booking anniversary trips. The whole thing had so much momentum that part of me wondered if I should simply let it go. Maybe they made an honest mistake. Maybe nobody intended to ignore my rights. Maybe fighting them would create more trouble than it was worth. That thought stayed with me for several days until something happened that changed everything. A contractor accidentally left a set of site plans visible inside a utility trailer near the shoreline. I wasn't snooping. The door was literally open while workers loaded equipment. As I walked past, I saw diagrams showing proposed modifications around the inlet stream. They weren't just using the lake. They were preparing to alter water flow patterns to support future recreational activities. That crossed a line. Suddenly, this wasn't just about advertisements or tourism brochures. They were planning physical changes to the water system connected to my family's spring. I called Laura the same afternoon. Let's move forward, I told her. She didn't hesitate. Within days, formal notices were filed with county officials. Detailed documentation accompanied every filing. Historical land records, water rights registrations, property surveys, decades of supporting evidence. Nothing dramatic happened at first. Then county inspectors started making phone calls. Then they requested additional records from Horizon Outdoor Ventures. Then they visited the site. You could practically feel the tension building across the valley. About 2 weeks later, I received a call from Laura. They're reviewing everything now, she said. And I don't think the developer expected this conversation to happen. A few days after that, the county reached its preliminary conclusion. The water source feeding the lake was indeed privately controlled under long-standing recorded rights. Until the legal situation was resolved, the resort could not advertise water-based recreation, could not alter the inlet stream, and could not commercially utilize the water resource without authorization. The compliance order landed like a bomb. News traveled fast in a small community. By the end of the week, everybody was talking about it. I ran into Frank at the local diner. He walked into my booth carrying a cup of coffee and a grin so wide it looked painful. Tell me you did not just shut down a 40-cabin resort. I tried not to smile. Technically, the county did. Frank laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. This is the best thing that's happened around here in years. Meanwhile, the mood at Horizon Outdoor Ventures was apparently much different. Through various contractors and local contacts, rumors started circulating. Meetings were being held almost daily. Marketing plans were being revised. Lawyers were reviewing documents. Investors wanted answers. Every delay was costing money. The resort still physically existed, of course. 40 beautiful cabins sat ready for guests. The roads were complete. The buildings were finished. The furniture was installed. But the main attraction had suddenly become unavailable. Imagine building a ski lodge and discovering you don't have access to the mountain. That's basically what happened. Then came the phone call. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was repairing a fence near the southern property line when my cell phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as Ryan Calloway, CEO of Horizon Outdoor Ventures. His voice was calm, professional, carefully controlled. Mr. Mercer, he said, I believe we've had a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. For nearly a year, nobody from his company had spoken to me. Now suddenly, there was a misunderstanding. Interesting word choice, I replied. A long silence followed. Then he said, perhaps we could meet and discuss a solution. We agreed to meet the following week. The conversation took place inside a conference room overlooking the unfinished resort. Ryan arrived with attorneys, project managers, and consultants. I brought Laura. The contrast was almost comical. They filled one entire side of the table. We occupied 2 chairs. At first, Ryan tried diplomacy. He talked about economic growth, tourism opportunities, job creation, community benefits. I listened politely. Then he finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. What exactly do you want? I looked out the window toward the lake. The same lake my grandfather had protected decades earlier. The same lake that had shaped most of my life. Then I turned back toward him. The respect that should have come before construction started. Nobody said a word. The room became completely silent. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I realized they finally understood something they should have understood from the beginning. The most important piece of their project had never been the cabins, the roads, the docks, or the marketing campaign. It was the water, and they didn't control it. For a few seconds after I said that, nobody in the room spoke. Ryan Calloway looked like a man trying to calculate the cost of a mistake in real time, and judging by the expression on his attorneys' faces, that number wasn't small. To his credit, he didn't lose his temper. He didn't threaten lawsuits. He didn't pound the table. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and asked a question that probably should have been asked a year earlier. So, where do we go from here? That was the moment everything changed. Because despite what some people later assumed, I never wanted to destroy the resort. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't trying to bankrupt anyone. The truth is, I understood why people wanted to visit the lake. I loved it myself. What bothered me wasn't the project. It was the arrogance behind it. The assumption that something valuable could simply be taken for granted because nobody expected resistance. Over the next several weeks, negotiations continued. There were long meetings, revised proposals, stacks of documents, and more legal language than any normal person should have to read in a lifetime. Eventually, we reached an agreement. Horizon Outdoor Ventures would receive limited commercial water use rights under strict conditions. They would be prohibited from altering the spring or changing the natural flow of the inlet stream without approval. Environmental protections would be implemented around sensitive areas of the shoreline. Guest activity limits would be established during certain seasons. Most importantly, the company would pay an annual fee dedicated entirely to maintaining and protecting the lake ecosystem. In other words, if they wanted to profit from the resource, they would also help preserve it. Once the agreement was finalized, county officials lifted the restrictions. The grand opening moved forward, just several months later than originally planned. Guests eventually arrived. Kayaks returned to the shoreline. Campfires glowed beside the cabins at night. Families took photographs from the dock while children skipped rocks across the water. Life moved on. But something interesting happened after all the headlines and gossip faded away. People started paying attention to the details hidden beneath properties they thought they understood. Local landowners began reviewing old records. Neighbors started asking questions about easements, mineral rights, access agreements, and water sources. More than once someone stopped me in town and said, "You know, I checked my paperwork after hearing your story." Every time that happened, I thought about my grandfather. That old man had protected something generations before it ever became valuable. Not because he could predict the future, but because he understood a simple truth. The things people overlook today often become the things everyone fights over tomorrow. About a year after the resort opened, I ran into Ryan again. We were both attending a county conservation fundraiser. By then the tension had mostly disappeared. He walked over, shook my hand, and surprised me with what he said next. "You know," he admitted, "that whole situation probably made the project better." I laughed. "I doubt your investors agree." He smiled. "Maybe not. But if nobody had forced us to slow down, we would have pushed a lot harder and made a lot more mistakes." For a moment we stood there looking across the room. Two people who had spent months on opposite sides of a fight neither of us originally expected to have. Then he nodded and said, "Your grandfather was smarter than all of us." On that point, we agreed completely. Even today, when I sit on the old cedar bench behind my cabin and watch the fog drift across the lake, I sometimes think about how close everything came to being different. Millions of dollars, dozens of buildings, endless planning meetings, professional consultants, engineers, architects, marketing teams. All of it ultimately depended on a small spring bubbling quietly out of a hillside that most people never noticed. That's the part of the story I find fascinating. The developer thought the cabins were the asset. The investors thought the views were the asset. The tourists thought the lake was the asset. In the end, the real asset was the one thing nobody bothered to ask about. And honestly, that's what I want to hear from you. Was I right to force the issue and protect my family's water rights? Or should I have simply stayed quiet and allowed the resort to operate without interference? Do you think the developer made an honest mistake, or were they counting on nobody checking the paperwork? Let me know in the comments because I've heard strong arguments from both sides over the years, and even now people still debate who was truly right and who was truly wrong. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates real property disputes where one forgotten document changes everything. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing on a piece of land isn't the building sitting on top of it. It's the tiny detail hidden deep inside the paperwork that nobody has looked at for decades.